Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm Thomas Wayment.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Joseph Smith once wrote in an article of faith, "We believe the Bible is the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly." But has anyone ever actually identified any of the errors, especially in the King James Version Bible? BYU professor Dr. Thomas Wayment will talk about the best translations out there, and he makes a really strong statement about a biblical forgery. This is a conversation you won't want to miss. It's really cool. Check out our conversation. Well, so as we move more into the New Testament period, I know some of I love biblical documentaries and things like that. I've heard that there's a source Q. Can you first tell us what is source Q?
Yeah, so the modern reader knows inherently that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are a lot alike. We just have read enough, we've heard enough. And what scholars started to realize about 200 years ago is that they're a lot more alike than you think. And that is, Matthew and Luke use almost all of Mark. They use all of his words, and they correct him. So we know that Mark misconjugates some verbs, and Luke will especially correct them.
Mark was the earliest gospel, we believe.
That's why we say that.
Okay.
Because you can't have the other logic working, that Luke got it right, and then Mark misconjugated all his verbs. So that becomes a really primary reason why we say Mark is first. So what scholars do at that point is they say, what if mathematically we just extract Mark out? We take the Gospel of Luke, and we just pull all of Mark out, and we do that to Matthew. And by doing that, you realize there are approximately 65 sayings that Matthew and Luke now have verbatim. And they're pretty substantial. This isn't just 3 words. These are 30 words exactly the same. And they're not in Mark. And that body of sayings is called the source. That's what Q means. It comes from the German Quelle, which means the source, and so it has this weird kind of mystery name, the source. And what it means is somewhere Matthew and Luke encountered a document, oral tradition, there's a debate which way it is, that they used. So they used Mark first, primarily, and then they used this other source also, more limited. And that source, they tend to, for as far as we can tell, maintain its accuracy. Whereas Mark, they were willing to say, Mark put it in this order, but we're going to really...
So we're going to redo the chronology and a few things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I've heard there's a Gospel of Thomas.
Yes.
I've heard that some people think that the Gospel of Thomas might be this source Q.
That's a little older theory, but it's out there. The Gospel of Thomas was discovered in one of the Nag Hammadi codices, and there have since been 3 smaller Greek fragments found at a little city in Egypt called Oxyrhynchus. And we have right now 114 sayings that are attributed to it. And they are very similar in part to the Synoptic Gospels. Not all of them, but of the 114, a large majority have strong parallels there. The problem is, in its current state, we only have the complete thing in Coptic. We don't have it all in Greek. And the other thing scholars have said for a while, and I'm of this opinion, I work on the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, is that it looks derivative. And I think what we wanted in that early period...
So you think Coptic was before the Greek? Is that what you're saying?
No, I think that Coptic Gospel of Thomas comes after the Greek New Testament.
Oh, okay.
I think it's taking from the Gospels and adapting and adjusting, etc. I think that's fairly confidently so. The movement to say that Thomas was the source happens in the 60s and briefly up until about the mid-1990s, 2000 period. And the argument there is that it has some parallels with Q. There are places where Thomas and Q agree, and those need to be accounted for. We don't want to dismiss those and whatnot. So theoretically, if you're taking that vantage point, what you're going to say then, different than what I would say, is that Thomas seems to know the earliest sayings of Jesus. And that's a hard academic position to kind of explain in a short moment, but effectively, if you will, we would say that the earliest layer of Jesus' sayings are Mark, and that Matthew and Luke then gather that and create this second generation of Christian text, and their final Gospels is kind of the last, their final form of the Gospels is the last version. And then you would say then Thomas taps into that earlier stage. That's how you would get an early Thomas. But for the modern reader, they're going to be surprised in it if they think that and read that, and they're not kind of in the scholarly argument, because Jesus is very ascetic there. He pushes very strongly against gender. He pushes against fasting and all kinds of things. He's an ascetic ideal. He wants you to starve. He wants you to kind of push back against all forms of lived Christianity.
Is he not a wine bibber in this?
He is not. No, he is everything but that. And yes, he.
Because in the Gospels, he liked to drink.
Right, but not in Thomas. He everything of this world is corrupt. Everything, even your body, and he wants you to think in terms of that. So that presents a very different view of Jesus.
That's very interesting. So was Thomas considered as part of a canonical gospel when they were trying to put the Bible or the New Testament together?
It's hard to say exactly those things because we have a 4th century copy. We don't know a lot about it earlier. There's a few people who quoted in the 2nd century, and we do know they knew Thomas, but we don't have a very good record of people saying, okay, is Thomas canonical? They're not really saying those type of sentences, so we can suppose that.
Is that because it was in Egypt and not in Jerusalem?
No, I think it's a happenstance of our records. We have a hint that the Gospel of Peter was debated canonically in parts. And that's just fortuitous. We don't really have that text until a much later copy, but we happen to know there was a debate about it. And I just think our sources that we survive just don't, perchance, talk about it the day that they wrote what they wrote that survives.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, very interesting. Well, I understand you've got a new book coming out here. Or it just came out, didn't it?
It did. It just came out, yes.
So tell us about this book.
Yeah, and this is always me trying to be careful for anybody listening or thinking about this. But as a scholar of religion for the last almost 20 years, it is such an obstacle for my students to appreciate the Bible. And it really hit me about 5 years ago, and I can't really, I'm not an actor, but I have a student come into class, and you can see the weight of the world on this student. And he shared with me, I said, hey, are you all right? And he says, oh, I'm in a Bible class. And this whole world is that this whole weight, it looks like somebody's died. This looks like something's happened to him, tragic. And he said, no, it's such a drag to be in a Bible class. And here I am as, a scholar of New Testament, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is Jesus we're talking about. He, if you don't believe in him, he is still a phenomenally fascinating person. And I started to probe that question, gosh, is Jesus really a drag to modern people? I don't think so. And what I've realized over the last decade, the Bible is really hard to read. It's an obstacle to faith. And what I mean by that, you put in front of a 14-year-old young person, and she reads the Bible, and they don't have any idea what thee and thou and doest and dost and that kind of language. This is foreign language to them. They don't speak of kingdoms and things. And I thought, for my class, I'm going to do a translation. I started translating all my slides on the screen, and I just did those translations. If I'm going to quote Matthew 21, I'm going to do a new one, and I'm going to tell my class that's my translation. I got a really good response to that, and in a moment of foolishness, I just said, I'm just going to do the whole thing for me. And that's about 10 years ago, and kept working on it, and about 5 years ago I got really serious and started pushing hard on it and completed it. It's now published, and it's a massive project. It's a modern translation that tries to be respectful of Latter-day Saint belief. So I am doing my best as a scholar to say, this is a respectful, aware translation that helps get rid of the obstacle of difficulty of understanding. And so a lot of things are changed in it. It's in paragraphs. It's not verse and then a sentence, end of sentence, next verse, and a space between them. This is in paragraphs. The verses are minimized, the size, so that you don't look at a page and see all these numbers. You see words. And that's how it was written originally, that the idea that things happened in sense units, and here's a sense unit. And then I add massive number of notes to help the reader. Hey, me as a translator, there are times when a Greek passage is ambiguous. So in a note, I said, well, here's how I've translated up here in the verse, but it could also mean this. And so I've tried to be very transparent in what's happening.
You know, we always joke about having your own translation of the Bible, but you've got one.
Well,
this is the Thomas Wayment translation of the Bible.
It is, and people say to me, hey, Tom, people die that translate the Bible. They get drawn and quartered, and yeah, that's on my mind. I appreciate that.
So this is specifically geared towards Latter-day Saints? It
is. I do think any Christian would pick up that Bible and feel familiar because it's modern. They are using modern translation in a lot of ways.
So this is Genesis through Revelation?
I only did Matthew through Revelation.
So the New Testament?
Yes.
Okay.
I would love to do Genesis through Malachi now, but that's 3 times as long.
So tell me about that. Did you go back to, and I know we don't have original manuscripts, but like Latin and Greek and Aramaic, and how did you put this together?
Yeah, scholars have access now to roughly the work of 200 years of people working on the text of the New Testament. They've published it in several different ways, and all of the manuscripts, what they say, and their variants. And so I translated mine out of what's called NA 28, Nestle Aland 28, which is the standard Bible for scholarship today. And I do that intuitively because there's times where it restores the text and puts a footnote, and I'll tell my reader, I put this in the main text because I think this has a higher likelihood of originality than NA 28. And so what modern translations are doing are they're bracketing certain stories that might not be original. So for example, the story of the woman caught in adultery. Very unlikely that that's originally written by John after verse 52. John 7:52 is where I think it happens. And very unlikely John did that. Now, is the story probably traced back to Jesus? In my opinion, yes. But the story appears in Luke, the story appears in 3 places in John, and we know it's a story of Jesus, but they didn't know where to put it. And so in my translation, I put it in brackets, and I explain that in the footnote. 1 John 5:7, that verse is forged in our Bible. When you go to Sunday school and you read 1 John 5:7, there is no scholar on the planet, I believe, that would say that verse is original. We know when it's forged, we know why it's forged, and so that comes out.
See, I've done a lot of Mark Hoffman stuff, so this is fascinating to me.
Right.
So tell me about that. What does the verse say, and why do you say it's forged?
It's a Trinitarian verse, and what I mean by that is it says that there's God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one. And so the verse is forged, and I should have looked up the exact date on this, but we know exactly the century when this happens. There's no manuscript prior to that, and when it happens, we believe it's probably written in the margin at first, like this is what this means or something, and somebody migrates that into the text. So in our King James, it's a fascinating story how we have it. The person who put together the Greek text for our King James Bible went to his local ecclesiastical leaders and said, this verse isn't in my manuscripts. And they produce a manuscript for him that has it, that's a forgery itself, and say, you better put this in. We're confident this is a forged verse. Yeah, so to put this back in kind of starting anew here, we are absolutely confident that 1 John 5:7 is a forgery.
Now, when you say we...
Scholars
are.
Yes.
So, your average... Well, go ahead.
Yeah, well, your average reader of the Bible has read this verse their entire life, the idea that the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, these 3 are one in heaven.
I mean, evangelicals will quote that constantly and say, "Look, you dumb Mormons, this is the Trinity."
Sure.
So are you telling me that is a forgery?
Absolutely. There's really no question about that. The first manuscript that ever has this, the first Greek manuscript, is from the 14th century. This just simply doesn't go back.
So it did not appear before the 14th century.
Right. And so we can't make the claim that this is ancient. And we know how it gets in the King James Bible. It gets in kind of a back door. And so going to this idea of my new translation, I've tried to help the reader know every major place where the Bible text is in question. Luke 22 is a place that we're not exactly sure if verses 43 and 44 were supposed to be there. Mark chapter 16, verse 8, everything after verse 8 might be added later. Now those verses, we don't want to use words forgery, but it looks like the oldest manuscripts ended with verse 8. And then we have 2 or 3 different endings called the longer and shorter. And scribes added these endings to make it fit Matthew or Luke's style. And so my new translation tries to grapple with all of that in a way that's both transparent and can help the reader say, I can form an opinion. Here's the kind of brief scholarly summary of it.
Well, that's fascinating because, and let me just tell you this. This is one of my frustrations as a Latter-day Saint, is we believe the Word of God as far as it is translated correctly. But, and I mean, this kind of leads into Joseph Smith's translation as well. And you've done some work on that as well, haven't you?
Yeah, yes.
And I think, well, we'll go there in a second. But if me as Joe member try to say, well, that's a mistranslation, and in fact, I've told this story before, but I got released, well, I didn't get released. I got called into the bishop's office when I was teaching a gospel doctrine class because I had asked a person to read a verse out of Isaiah, and I said, what does that mean? And he said, I have no idea. And I said, would you please read it out of the NLT version, New Literal Translation, I think is what it stood for. And it made so much more sense to me.
Yeah.
And I got called into bishop's office because I used a non-King James Version Bible.
I'm in trouble.
Exactly. So I can't use to be honest, I would love to read this because it sounds awesome. But can Latter-day Saints use this without... I mean, I was the gospel doctrine teacher, but I got called into the bishop's office for using a Bible.
Yeah, and I don't want that to happen. I don't want my translation to become this thing for people getting called into the bishop. So a couple thoughts that maybe can engage this. We have an absolute kind of commitment for the English-speaking world to the King James Version, but the church does not bear that commitment in any other language family. So as Latter-day Saints English-speaking, white North Americans are increasingly a minority in the church, we are increasingly this smaller and smaller pool of King James users. But what's fascinating, what many Latter-day Saints don't realize, the church is producing this Spanish translation, which is out, a Portuguese translation, I believe, and a French and a German translation. And I don't know the status of all of those, but they're incredibly modern. And so right on the same pew, I can productively read the church's Spanish translation and have a very different experience with Jesus. And then I have to use this archaic English. Now, since I can read both, I can use both church-approved materials. And I know there's a lot of reasons why we don't adopt a modern translation of the English Bible. But my opinion, and it's a strong one, and I'll stand by it, I think when the English becomes an obstacle to a person's faith, it's time to reassess. I think when that gets in the way, we need to say, what could I do to help my children, my friends, the youth I know, my peers? And it's English, just like you said, that Isaiah is impossible to understand in the KJV. I tell people in the New Testament the KJV reaches its low point in Romans. Romans is its worst.
Oh, Romans is terrible.
It is, but it's really not that terrible in English. But it is pretty rough in the KJV, and I think we could gain a lot. And it doesn't need to be mine. I'm not here pushing mine. There are wonderfully good English translations. The ESV is really good. You used a literal one. Mm-hmm. Those tend to have a little more familiarity with King James type approach in their translation approach. The RSV is really good, and the NRSV are all really good.
What about the NIV?
It's very good. I don't have any quibbles with the NIV. It's a good translation.
I just had a really strange conversation on Facebook in it was called Mormons and Biblical Discussion Facebook group, and I was like, where's the biblical discussion here? Because it just felt like a Mormon bashing session. But
sure.
At any rate, I had quoted something about the NIV, and an evangelical threw back in my face, the NIV is not a good translation, and King James Version was it. And I was like, really?
Wow, it sounds a Baptist moment.
It must have been, because
the King James Version only.
They sound Baptist to me. I served my mission in South Carolina. I'm very familiar with Baptists, and they drive me crazy sometimes.
Well, there's a KJV only movement, and it tends to have Baptist support. Not officially, but I think that there's this idea, an absolute point, that the King James is inspired English even. And that creeps into English, Latter-day Saint dialogue too, that the actual English words are inspired. And the KJV people make no claim of that. Historically, these are academics appointed at Cambridge and other universities. They don't claim inspiration. They claim, just like myself, I'm a scholar, I read Greek, I'm going to do my very best to make this happen. NIV's received some criticism by its own community, and that's why I didn't mention it. Some leading evangelicals like N.T. Wright have said, we could do better. And so for that reason, since they're rethinking their own translation, I don't promote it, but absolutely it's a great translation.
So can you give us, say, your top 5 or top 3 best Bible translations out there?
Yeah, absolutely. English Standard Version is the one I came to really appreciate in this process. I love the balance because it tends to favor being literal while giving the meaning. Our RSV is probably my next favorite. That's the Revised Standard Version. And again, it tries to maintain some connection to literal translation. And so on a spectrum, translations exist between very literal and very literary or paraphrastic. And so I like the pendulum going towards literal. Less literal, but I like a lot, is the NRSV. That's the Bible of academia. And so I came to really appreciate that Bible.
So academics like me, NRSV the best?
Very common, yes. So HarperCollins Study Bible is a really common version of the NRSV that a lot of academics own and have on their shelves. I like the NIV. I think it's a good Bible. It's not my go-to, but I do like it. And I really like the Net Bible, which is free out there. People can hop on. It's done by a very, very good scholar, Daniel Wallace. He's just excellent, and it's a good Bible too. And you pick it up online. I don't love to read online, but it's a good one too. So those are kind of ones I would go to if I want to relook at a passage.
So those are not quite as good as yours, though?
Well, mine, I want mine to be in that family. I would love that for somebody to think of mine in terms of that family. But those are high-quality products.
Well, that's awesome. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Tom Wayment. In our next and final conversation, we're going to talk about the Joseph Smith translation. Tom has made an amazing discovery tying the Joseph Smith translation to Adam Clarke's Bible commentary.
Joseph knows that the italics are words that the KJV people are telling you aren't exactly in the Greek, that we had to supply this word. And Joseph is highly suspicious of them. 70% of those are corrected by him. And Clarke is predominantly the source he uses for that.
If you'd like a transcript of this conversation, we'll have it out shortly. I'd also like to thank you for those of you who are subscribing on patreon.com. Please tell your friends. It's really helpful and will help support future documentaries and podcasts such as this. Also, make sure that you subscribe on our Facebook page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can get our Twitter updates at Gospel Tangents. Also, make sure that if you'd like a written copy, go to our Amazon page. You can search for that. I've got a link here, but just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you should be able to find it there. You can also purchase a transcript of this at gospeltangents.com/shop. All of those proceeds will go to me and not to Amazon, so I really encourage you to do that. Make sure that you subscribe on our Apple Podcast page. I've got a link here, but you can just do a search for Gospel Tangents there. If you'd like to get a transcript, click here. To subscribe here on YouTube, go ahead and click here. And over here, you'll see some of our other videos. Thanks for listening, and we appreciate you listening to Gospel Tangents.